Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, so there's something really quite interesting happening in Africa concerning health patterns.
Yeah, it's this surprising increase in diseases we often associate more with, Western countries.
Mhm.
Things like heart disease, diabetes.
Exactly. And what's maybe even more startling is that in the cities, the death rates from these conditions are actually overtaking those in rural areas.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? What's
Yeah.
behind this shift?
Right. What's
Yeah.
driving it? And crucially, could there be lessons here for all of us, really, for understanding our own health, no matter where we live?
That's a really important question. And to try and get some answers, we're going to dive deep into a fascinating new study today.
Okay. What's the study about?
Well, it directly investigated how changing your diet impacts your health. Specifically, it compared a traditional African way of eating with a more typical Western-style diet.
Okay, yeah, I saw this one. Published in Nature Medicine just this past April 2025, right?
That's the one. It was a collaboration between researchers at Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands and KCMC University in Tanzania.
And what makes it particularly interesting, I think, is that they weren't just asking people what they ate. They actually observed real dietary changes and measured the biological consequences.
Precisely. And it's worth pointing out, even if your own diet doesn't perfectly fit the Western label used in the study, the findings about inflammation, immune function, processed foods, well, they're likely relevant for understanding your own health, too.
Good point. Okay, so let's unpack this study. What was the main goal the researchers had?
Their primary aim was to understand the immunometabolic effects, basically, how switching between a traditional African diet and a Western diet affects the immune system and metabolism.
Metabolism meaning how the body processes energy from food.
Exactly. And they also specifically looked at the impact of a traditional fermented banana beverage called Mbege.
Interesting. Okay, so who actually took part in the research?
They recruited 77 healthy men from Tanzania. Some lived in urban areas, others in more rural settings.
And that distinction mattered because their usual diets were different.
Yes, generally speaking, the rural participants tended to follow a more traditional African diet, while the urban participants were already consuming a more westernized diet.
Got it. So how did they structure the actual experiment? You said they changed diets.
They did. It wasn't just observation. They had several groups. One group of rural participants switched from their traditional diet to a Western diet for 2 weeks.
Okay.
Then another group, urban participants, did the opposite. They switched from their usual Western diet to a traditional African diet,
Right.
also for 2 weeks.
Right. And the banana drink.
Ah, yes, there was a third group. These participants kept eating their normal Western diet, but added a daily serving of the Mbege drink for 1 week.
Okay. And I assume there was a control group.
Yes, a smaller group of 10 participants just maintained their usual diet throughout the study period, serving as a baseline for comparison.
That seems like a pretty solid design. How did they track the effects of these dietary shifts? What measurements did they take?
They took measurements at 3 key times. First at the baseline, before any changes. Then immediately after the dietary intervention period, so after 2 weeks for the diet swaps, or 1 week for the Mbege, and finally they did a follow-up 4 weeks later.
To see if the effects stuck around.
Exactly. They analyzed immune system function, looked for markers of inflammation in the blood, and assessed various metabolic processes, really looking at the biological changes.
Can you give us a bit more detail on what those diets actually involved? What kinds of foods are we talking about for the traditional African diet?
Sure. The traditional African diet, or the Kilimanjaro heritage diet as I called it, was really rich in plant-based foods. Lots of vegetables, fruits, beans, whole grains like millet and sorghum. Fermented foods were also a key component, including that Mbege drink. So typical meals might be something like finger millet porridge with sour milk and taro, or boiled green banana with kidney beans and avocado, or ugali, a type of maize porridge served with okra and other green vegetables.
Okay, sounds very nutrient-dense, lots of fiber. Now, contrast that with the Western diet they use.
Right. The Western diet was characterized by, well, more processed, higher calorie foods. Think French fries, white bread, lots of salt, refined sugars, saturated fats.
So typical examples.
Yeah, things like sausage, white bread with margarine, and jam for breakfast perhaps, or kipsi which is basically a Tanzanian dish of French fries cooked with eggs. Also chicken, mayonnaise, ketchup, pancakes, biscuits. that kind of thing.
Wow, quite the difference. Okay, so when they were taking blood samples and doing tests, what specific things were they measuring to track inflammation and immune function?
They looked closely at inflammatory biomarkers, specific proteins in the blood that indicate inflammation levels. C-reactive protein is a common one they measured. They also tested how well the participants' immune cells produced cytokines. Those are signaling molecules the immune system uses in response to various triggers. And they analyzed the plasma metabolome.
The sort of fingerprint of small molecules in the blood?
Exactly, reflecting metabolic activity. And the whole blood transcriptome, which shows which genes are switched on or off in the blood cells. Plus, they counted the different types of circulating white blood cells.
Okay, that's a comprehensive picture. Let's get to the results then. What happened to the group that switched to the Western diet? What were the implications?
This is where it gets really telling. The group that moved from the traditional diet to the Western diet showed a distinct increase in inflammatory proteins circulating in their blood. They specifically mentioned rises in proteins like CNTP1, THBS4, ANGPTL3, and TWEAK.
And these proteins aren't just random, are they? What do those increases actually mean?
No, they're significant. The researchers noted that these increases signaled the activation of biological pathways linked to the development of lifestyle diseases.
Such as?
Things like cell adhesion, how cells stick together, which can be involved in artery plaque formation. Also, increased activity of certain enzymes, processes related to programmed cell death, and protein breakdown activity. So even after just 2 weeks, the diet seemed to be triggering processes associated with chronic illness down the line.
That's concerning. What about their immune system's ability to fight things off?
That seemed to take a hit too. Their immune cells became less effective. When stimulated in the lab, these cells produced lower amounts of key defensive molecules, like tumor necrosis factor and interferon gamma, especially in response to the fungus Candida albicans.
So less firepower against potential infections.
Seems like it. And on top of that, their overall levels of C-reactive protein, that general inflammation marker, went up. It suggests the Western diet was promoting inflammation and potentially hindering the immune response.
Not a great combination. Any other changes in that group?
Yes, they also found increased activity in genes related to reactive oxygen species. Think of those as potentially damaging molecules produced during metabolism, like cellular exhaust.
Okay, oxidative stress.
Right. And also, genes involved in defending against pathogens were upregulated. At the cellular level, they saw more white blood cells overall, especially neutrophils and immature granulocytes, and these neutrophils showed signs of activation.
So the immune system was sort of on alert, but maybe not responding effectively?
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, some of those neutrophil activation markers were still elevated 4 weeks later, even after they presumably went back to their usual diet.
Wow, suggesting even a short stint on that diet could have lingering effects.
It certainly suggests that, yes.
Okay, so that's the Western diet switch. What about the flip side, the urban group that switched from Western to the traditional African diet? Did they see benefits?
They generally did. This group showed a reduction in inflammatory markers. Specific chemokines and cytokines involved in inflammation decreased.
That's positive.
Yes. And they observed changes in proteins linked to cytokine activity, the inflammatory response itself, cell movement, and even host virus interactions. Plus, there was a trend towards lower C-reactive protein levels. So, moving towards the traditional diet seemed to dial down inflammation.
That makes intuitive sense. Did their immune cell responses change much?
Not dramatically overall in terms of cytokine production during the main intervention. However, at the 4-week follow-up, there were some specific increases in anti-inflammatory responses. And importantly, unlike the Western diet group, they didn't see significant changes in their white blood cell counts.
Suggesting the traditional diet wasn't triggering that same kind of potentially problematic immune activation.
Exactly. It seemed to be promoting a less inflammatory state without necessarily revving up the immune system in the same way.
Okay, that's encouraging. Now, what about that third group, the ones who stayed on a Western diet but added the fermented banana drink, Mbege?
The Mbege group was interesting. They saw an increase in various plasma proteins, mostly related to cardiometabolic health, things involved in heart function and metabolism.
Okay.
But critically, they also experienced a sustained reduction in several inflammatory markers. Things like certain CC chemokines, an enzyme called matrix metalloproteinase 1, and inflammatory signals like interleukin-17A and oncostatin M. And this reduction persisted at the 4-week follow-up.
So the drinks seem to have an anti-inflammatory effect even alongside the Western diet.
It appeared so, and their immune cell responses also changed. They showed increased production of an anti-inflammatory cytokine called interleukin-10.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly, they had enhanced cytokine responses specifically to Candida albicans, suggesting maybe a better targeted response to that particular microbe. Plus, they had reduced markers of neutrophil activation similar to the traditional diet group.
Any hints from the gene or molecule analysis about why Mbege might be beneficial?
Yes, they noted an upregulation of metabolic pathways related to flavin-3-ols. These are compounds found in plants, like tea and cocoa, often linked with good vascular health.
Ah, interesting connection.
And they also saw a downregulation of genes involved in cell migration and inflammation processes. So multiple lines of evidence pointing towards potential benefits from this traditional fermented drink.
Fascinating. Okay, this all sounds quite compelling, but every study has its limitations. What caveats should we keep in mind here?
Absolutely. It's crucial. One key thing is that the food wasn't calorie-controlled. Participants could eat as much as they wanted ad libitum. The group switching to the Western diet actually gained weight.
Right, and weight gain itself can increase inflammation?
Precisely. So it's hard to completely disentangle the effects of the diet composition from the effects of the associated weight gain in that group. That's a confounder.
Good point. What else?
The intervention period was quite short, just 2 weeks for the main diet swaps, 1 week from Mbege. While they saw effects, and the researchers argue even short periods matter for immunity, we can't really extrapolate to long-term clinical outcomes like actually developing heart disease or diabetes based on this alone.
Makes sense.
Also, the study only included men. We don't know if the results would be identical in women or in different age groups. And the sample size, while typical for this kind of intensive study, was relatively small.
Were there limitations in the measurements themselves?
Well, the study gave great molecular insights, but didn't track actual disease development over time. And the metabolomics analysis, looking at all those small molecules, used a non-targeted approach. That's good for discovery, but might not definitively identify every single compound.
Okay.
And finally, while the traditional diet they use reflects healthy principles, it's important to remember that Tanzania, like many places, has diverse dietary traditions. So these findings might not perfectly represent all heritage diets, even within that region.
Right. Context matters. Thanks for laying out those limitations. So, putting it all together, what were the main conclusions from the researchers themselves? What did Corinne Damast, the internist involved, emphasize?
He really highlighted how remarkable it was to see such clear diet-induced changes in inflammation and metabolism in just 2 weeks. He stressed the apparent benefits of the traditional African foods for reducing inflammation and improving metabolic markers, contrasting that sharply with the negative impacts of the Western diet.
And he saw this as relevant beyond Africa, right?
Definitely. He pointed out that since chronic inflammation underpins so many major diseases prevalent in Western countries too, these findings are highly relevant globally. He also noted this was really the first study to comprehensively map the health effects of this kind of traditional African diet in such detail.
And they're thinking on why the diets had such different effects.
They proposed that the benefits of the heritage diet likely stem from a synergy, the combined effect of all the diverse whole foods, fiber, and bioactive compounds working together.
Makes sense.
Whereas the Western diet's negative effects, they suggested it's probably a mix of things. Direct inflammatory effects from processed ingredients, sugars, unhealthy fats, but also indirect effects, perhaps via negative changes in gut bacteria, and of course contributing to that observed weight gain.
And the Mbege drink.
They specifically highlighted the potential health benefits of traditional African fermented beverages, like Mbege, likely due to the bioactive metabolites produced during fermentation and perhaps the microbes themselves.
This has been a really thorough exploration. As we wrap up, what's the single most important message people should take away from this deep dive?
I think the core message is just how rapidly and profoundly our dietary choices impact our fundamental biology, particularly our immune system and metabolic health. This study provides pretty clear evidence for the protective qualities of diets centered around whole plant foods, fiber, and perhaps fermented foods.
And conversely, the potential downsides of diets heavy in processed items, refined sugars, and unhealthy fats, like the Western pattern studied here.
Exactly. It's a powerful demonstration.
It really is, and it leaves you with a bit of a challenge, doesn't it? A final thought, maybe.
Well, it certainly provokes thought. If just a couple of weeks can cause these measurable biological shifts, what are the long-term cumulative effects of the way you eat day in, day out? It really encourages you to consider, What small changes could you make? Could you incorporate more whole plant foods? Maybe explore some fermented options. The study suggests the impact might be deeper and faster than we often assume.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.